The morning light came through the curtains in the way it always had, soft and golden, scattering across the wooden floor in lazy streaks. Yet somehow it didn't feel familiar. There was a subtle chill that lingered, a kind of quiet that pressed against the edges of thought. The smell of coffee reached me as it always did, but it tasted muted somehow, like warmth I had grown used to, now slightly hollow. I sipped slowly, hoping the ritual would anchor me, but even that small comfort seemed distant, as if the cup had been filled with memories I couldn't quite reach. I looked into the mirror and paused, noticing the reflection that had once felt like me. The eyes staring back seemed smaller, heavier. A faint crease where a smile should have been hinted at something I had long ignored. The day outside felt ordinary. The neighborhood still alive with its quiet routines, the newspaper rattling in the wind, a dog barking faintly somewhere down the street. And yet inside, I felt that subtle dissonance, a gentle tug of unfamiliarity. I realized with a slow and careful awareness that something in my life had shifted, though nothing had visibly changed. I moved through the kitchen slowly, brushing fingers over the counter where crumbs from yesterday still lingered. The familiar items, the kettle, the chipped mug, the small vase by the window, all seemed slightly off balance. That mug, with its faint crack along the rim, had always been the one I reached for, always sturdy in its imperfection. Today, it felt like a symbol, a quiet reminder that even the things we take for granted carry their own fragile truths. I held it in my hands and thought about how many times I had ignored the little fractures in my own life, pretending that the surface was enough. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than usual, as if it were nudging me toward noticing the subtle irregularities. I walked to the window, pressed my hands lightly against the cool glass, and let my gaze drift over the street. Children waited at the bus stop. Neighbors spoke softly across fences, and the air smelled faintly of rain that hadn't yet arrived. I breathed in and out slowly, sensing that this morning was different, though I couldn't yet place why. It was as if the world had shifted just enough to reveal the spaces I had been avoiding, the quiet truths tucked between routines and smiles. Sitting at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, I traced my finger along the rim of the mug and remembered the mornings I had woken up feeling at home, feeling grounded. Those mornings had been filled with certainty, the comfort of knowing where I belonged, the gentle rhythm of my life. But this morning, certainty had slipped away like water through fingers. I noticed a faint shadow across the table, a reminder of things left unspoken, of small cracks that I had long ignored. And in that silence, I felt a whisper of something unnameable, a gentle unease that demanded attention. I allowed myself to linger in the quiet, listening to the small sounds that had always existed, but were usually drowned out by busyness. The faint ticking of the clock, the creak of the floorboards under my weight, the distant hum of a car on the street. All seemed heightened, deliberate, as though the house itself were speaking. It reminded me that life is often measured not by the grand moments, but by the small, almost invisible shifts, the tiny ruptures that signal change long before we name it. And then, as I set the mug down, I realized that I was noticing more than the world around me. I was noticing myself, the way I had been moving through life with quiet compliance, the way I had been performing a version of contentment that no longer fit. I remembered smiling through conversations that had grown shallow, nodding at assurances that felt hollow, pretending that everything was fine because it was easier than confronting what wasn't. And now, for the first time in a long while, I sensed the first stirrings of honesty, a quiet acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, I had been living in a kind of gentle pretense. The sunlight shifted as the morning deepened, spilling more fully across the room. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams, turning the air itself into a kind of fragile gold. I watched them drift and felt a quiet kinship with their slow, deliberate movement. I realized that my life, like this morning light, had always been real, in pieces. Pieces that had been overlooked, fragments that had been hidden beneath routines and expectations. And as the morning wore on, I sat in that realization, feeling both the tenderness and the weight of noticing, the soft ache of understanding that life was quietly asking me to pay attention. It was not a dramatic awakening. There were no sudden revelations, no shattering of the ordinary. Instead, it was the kind of morning that asks for quiet observation, for gentle reckoning. A day that feels ordinary to everyone else, but in which the seeds of change quietly settle. I sipped the coffee again, letting the warmth fill me in the slow way that comfort can. And I thought, without judgment, that perhaps it was time to start noticing all the things I had been ignoring. The house was still, the light warm, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt both familiar and entirely new. And in that delicate balance, I began to see that life had been speaking softly all along, through chipped mugs, through quiet shadows, through mornings that felt different without announcing why. And I knew somehow that I was ready to listen. The house always looked as though nothing could disturb its calm. The furniture was neatly arranged, polished just enough to catch the soft glow of afternoon light. Curtains swayed gently with the breeze, dust motes drifting in golden shafts that made the ordinary seem almost sacred. On the surface, it was the kind of home that promised warmth, routine, and stability, the kind that strangers might envy. The smell of freshly brewed coffee in the morning, the faint aroma of dinners cooking in the kitchen, the sound of polite laughter drifting from the dining room. These were the familiar notes of a life everyone assumed was content. And I had painted it so well. Every day, with my smiles, my quiet gestures of composure, my careful attention to appearances, I would sit at the dinner table, letting the clink of cutlery become our conversation, nodding when words weren't enough, filling in the silences with gentle murmurs that hid more than they revealed. Each evening was a rehearsal, the table set precisely, the conversations flowing like a practiced dance. I watched myself perform these little acts, sometimes aware of their hollowness, sometimes unaware, lost in the comfort of routine. It was a life that seemed stable because it was meticulously curated. I had a role to play, and I played it faithfully. The partner who kept everything running smoothly, the one who smiled even when her chest felt heavy, the one who nodded and agreed when disagreements threatened to surface. It was easier than letting anyone see the cracks, the small fissures where hope had dulled, where laughter had become automatic. I had learned early on that honesty could be disruptive, that expressing discomfort could shatter the fragile order we built together. So I learned to perform, and the performance became second nature. Yet beneath the warm light and tidy rooms, there was a quiet unease I could no longer ignore. It grew in the spaces between routines, in the way the evening sun fell differently across the living room, in the way the silence stretched just a little too long after the television turned off. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when I felt the weight of pretending press heavily on my chest. A glance exchanged at the table, a sigh in the hallway, a hand lingering too long over a cup of tea. These tiny signals whispered truths I had been avoiding. I remember the early days of marriage, the love that had felt raw, thrilling, alive. Those mornings when we would laugh over coffee, when words spilled freely without caution, when touch was unguarded. Life had seemed abundant then, and perhaps that abundance made the later quiet so much harder to notice, because love doesn't always fade dramatically. Sometimes it drifts, imperceptible, until the currents of habit carry you along, and you only realize how far you've moved when you glance backward and see the shore is empty. Every day, I performed what others expected. I smiled at neighbors, shared stories with colleagues, laughed softly at the predictable humor of friends. Inside, I moved through a fog of quiet yearning, of small, unspoken questions. When did I start accepting this life as enough? When did the small joys of being truly seen become foreign, almost unattainable? There were hints along the way, subtle signals that something had shifted, but they were easily dismissed. Too small, too inconvenient, too fragile to confront. And so I continued the act, polishing the exterior until it gleamed, while the interior gathered dust. The small cracks were there, though, waiting patiently. In the kitchen, a chipped plate I kept for years, thinking it too minor to replace, became a symbol of the imperfection I refused to face. At night, when the house quieted and shadows stretched along the walls, I would notice the absence of certain conversations, the lack of questions asked about my day, the way a glance could pass without recognition. And still, I chose to keep moving, to keep smiling, to keep performing, because pretending was easier than admitting that the life I lived wasn't entirely mine. There were other signs too, small, overlooked incidents that hinted at deeper truths. A letter left unopened on the counter, a dinner eaten in silence, a moment when the touch of a hand felt absent instead of comforting. At first, I would rationalize them, telling myself that everyone has busy days, that tiredness explains distant looks, that politeness sometimes feels like emptiness. But slowly, the rationalizations began to feel hollow. The life I had painted with polite smiles was not just imperfect. It was a carefully arranged illusion, a mosaic of appearances that concealed the ache beneath. I think now about how much energy it took to maintain that illusion. The rehearsed laughter, the practiced nods, the constant smoothing over of small annoyances. My body knew the routine by heart before my mind caught up. I moved through rooms like a ghost of my former self, performing duties, answering questions, and keeping the quiet promise to not disturb the delicate balance of appearances. And in that performance, I began to lose touch with the person I had once been. The one who had noticed the colors of the sky, who had lingered over music that made her heart ache, who had spoken without fear. The paradox of this life was that it felt safe precisely because it was untrue. Safety lay in predictability, in the absence of confrontation, in the muted rhythms of a world where no one asked too many questions. And yet, with safety came a quiet suffocation, a sense that my own self had been gradually folded into the margins. I could no longer distinguish the warmth of genuine connection from the comfort of routine. Each smile, each nod, each polite gesture felt like both a shield and a weight, a preservation of appearances and a denial of reality. It was during these quiet, routine moments that I first noticed the stirrings of doubt. Perhaps it was a glance in the mirror that lingered too long, a sigh I didn't recognize as my own, or a fleeting thought that whispered, "What am I missing?" These small moments began to ripple outward, questioning everything I had accepted as normal. And though I tried to dismiss them, the tension grew like water in a vessel, quiet but persistent, filling the spaces I had once thought empty. Even in the company of others, I felt the subtle discord. Conversations felt surface level, words missing the weight they once held. I laughed when appropriate, nodded when expected, and answered questions that never quite reached the part of me that longed to be heard. And sometimes, in the quiet of a late evening, I would allow myself a small private acknowledgement. This life, for all its comfort and polish, was not entirely mine. Something had been quietly overlooked, quietly surrendered, quietly hidden. And yet, there was no sudden revelation here, no dramatic moment of awakening. Only a slow, creeping awareness that the life I had painted with polite smiles was also the life I had carefully hidden from myself. It was in the subtle dissonance, the tiny hints of hollowness behind familiar routines, that the truth began to press softly, insistently, against the edges of my consciousness. I would sit at the table, hands folded over the chipped mug that had become my quiet companion, and allow the weight of these thoughts to settle. I could feel the years of unnoticed compromise, of small acts of self-denial, pressing gently against the back of my mind. And yet, there was a strange tenderness in noticing it all, an acknowledgement that I had tried, in my own way, to preserve warmth and stability in a world that felt increasingly fragile. The act of noticing, small as it was, became the first quiet step toward understanding the full shape of my life, both the comfort and the cracks that lay beneath. It was in these reflections, mingled with the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle afternoon light, that I began to sense the deeper truths waiting quietly in the shadows. The life I had painted with polite smiles was both a masterpiece and a mask, and somewhere between the strokes of routine and the pauses of quiet unease, I realized that to move forward, I would need to begin noticing all the small fractures I had long ignored, the whispers of truth hidden beneath the veneer of daily life. The first warning came softly, almost imperceptibly. A glance that lingered a second too long at the edge of the kitchen doorway, a word left unspoken at the dinner table, a note I happened to glimpse but didn't read. At the time, I dismissed them as nothing, small incongruities that could easily be explained. But in retrospect, they were the first tremors beneath the steady hum of my life, gentle signals of the fissures I had been too comfortable to notice. Sometimes, it was a silence that pressed in unexpectedly, The kind of silence that didn't feel empty but full of things I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I would sit across from the person I loved, listening to the muted sound of dishes clinking or the occasional soft sigh, and I would convince myself that nothing was wrong. Perhaps they were tired. Perhaps I was reading too much into ordinary moments, but deep down, in the quiet corners of my chest, a flicker of unease refused to be silenced. Other warnings came in subtler forms. A letter left unopened on the counter. The faint scent of perfume I didn't recognize lingering in a coat pocket. A phone call that was returned hours later with hurried words that avoided explanation. At the time, I rationalized each instance. Convenient explanations that allowed me to continue the rhythm of my life without questioning its foundation. The act of ignoring became a practice, a way to preserve the fragile illusion of normalcy. And yet, each ignored warning accumulated like dust in the corners of a room. Slowly, imperceptibly, it settled around my thoughts, pressing softly until I could no longer entirely dismiss it. There was a quiet tension in the air, a sense that something had shifted imperceptibly while I had been preoccupied with the comfort of routine. The life I had built, carefully curated and rehearsed, was beginning to whisper its own doubts. And I was only just beginning to hear. I remember the first time I felt a pang of real shock. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with raised voices or slamming doors. It was a single, almost mundane detail that didn't belong. A receipt, an unfamiliar item, a name I didn't recognize on a message that appeared by chance. For a moment, my mind raced to make sense of it, to rationalize it away. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was coincidence. But as the seconds passed, the feeling in my chest grew heavier, more insistent. It was the first true disruption of the seamless performance I had been sustaining for years. That night, sleep felt distant. I lay in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of the house breathing, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the gentle creak of floorboards, the muted whistle of wind brushing against the windows. Each sound seemed to carry a question I didn't yet have the courage to answer. I thought about the small, overlooked warnings, and a quiet disbelief settled over me. Could it really be that all this time, I had been living in a carefully constructed illusion? That the life I had trusted, the life I had performed so faithfully, might not be as solid as I had believed? In the following days, the warnings multiplied. I noticed fleeting moments that had always been there, now magnified by the lens of suspicion. A lingering glance that seemed too pointed, an email that arrived at an odd hour, a conversation abruptly ended. The very routines that had comforted me now carried shadows, subtle shifts in tone, in timing, in presence. I felt my heart tightening with a mixture of fear and anticipation, as if I were standing on the edge of a quiet precipice I hadn't seen before. And yet, I hesitated. To confront these signs would mean breaking the fragile order I had maintained for so long. To look too closely, to ask too many questions, felt risky, almost dangerous. So I continued to ignore them, convincing myself that routine was safer than discovery. But each ignored warning weighed on me, like a soft but persistent ache beneath the chest, reminding me that the world I had trusted might be built on quiet lies. One evening, a particularly subtle warning struck me with the force of clarity. I stumbled upon a message, one that didn't belong, a name I hadn't heard in years, and a single thought echoed in my mind. I cannot pretend this is nothing. My breath caught, not in anger, not in rage, but in a quiet, staggering disbelief. The realization that my life, as carefully curated as it appeared, could harbor secrets I had never suspected left me trembling. The air around me seemed thinner, charged with the weight of truths I had refused to face. I began to see the pattern in retrospect. The small anomalies, the quiet inconsistencies, the things I had dismissed as unimportant, they were all warnings. Each one had pointed toward the same truth, that the life I had inhabited, the world I had performed so diligently, was quietly unraveling. And I had ignored them, not out of ignorance, but out of fear. Fear of loss, fear of disruption, fear of the person I might discover beneath the carefully painted exterior. The disbelief that accompanied these realizations was profound. It was not dramatic. It was slow, insidious, creeping into every thought, coloring every memory. I replayed moments from months, even years before, noticing them anew, a casual remark, a fleeting glance, a half-finished conversation, all now tinged with a new meaning. The world I had trusted so implicitly suddenly seemed fragile, precarious, and uncertain. At times, I felt as though I were moving through a haze, observing life from the edge, aware of what had been hidden, and yet hesitant to fully confront it. My routine continued mechanically, the meals, the work, the chores, but each act was underlain with a quiet tension. The house felt different. The walls seemed thinner, the air heavier, the light less forgiving, and in that quiet tension, I began to understand the cost of ignoring the warnings, the small fractures that had grown, patiently, quietly, into the beginnings of truth. I realized then, with a mix of fear and clarity, that ignoring the signs no longer felt possible. The quiet warnings I had chosen to overlook had gathered their own weight, pressing against the walls of my perception until denial could no longer hold. The world I had painted with careful routines and polite smiles was revealing its hidden seams. And I knew, in the deepest part of myself, that the next step, the confrontation with reality, was both inevitable and necessary. The days that followed were quiet, in a way that felt both unnatural and heavy. Time seemed to stretch unevenly, each morning folding into the next without the comforting rhythm I had relied on for so long. I moved through the motions of life, waking, eating, working, cleaning. But each act felt hollow, as though I were performing behind a veil. The house, once a space of warmth and familiarity, now felt vast and unresponsive. Shadows lingered in corners I hadn't noticed before, and even the sunlight that poured through the windows seemed muted, filtered through some unseen grief. I began to notice details I had never paid attention to. A chair left empty at the dinner table carried an echo of absence. The ticking of the clock was sharper, insistent, almost impatient. I would stand at the window, watching the wind lift leaves from the trees, and feel the weight of moments I had ignored, of the quiet warnings I had chosen to dismiss. They returned to me now, amplified, forming a chorus of regret that I could neither silence nor fully face. The isolation was subtle, but persistent. Friends and neighbors carried on, unaware of the turmoil simmering beneath my calm exterior. I would smile at casual greetings, nod politely at small talk, and in those moments I felt like a ghost inhabiting a familiar shell. Inside, the quiet was growing, heavy and pressing, a hum of absence that seemed to seep into the very air I breathed. No one saw the tremor in my hands as I poured coffee. No one noticed the pause I took at the doorway, staring at rooms that felt suddenly unfamiliar. I existed in plain sight, and yet the life around me had taken on the quality of a dream I could not wake from. Objects, once trivial, now carried weighty significance. The chipped mug I had kept for years, a quiet emblem of everyday imperfection, had become a symbol of loss. One morning I held it in my hands and felt its edges, uneven, fragile, and for the first time, I allowed myself to see it as more than a cup. It was a vessel of memories I had ignored, small betrayals I had rationalized, the quiet accumulation of years spent pretending. When I finally let it slip from my fingers, it landed on the counter with a soft, final clink. One small piece remained in my hand, a shard catching the faint morning light, and I held it as if it were proof that not everything could be erased. Even in grief, at work, the routine carried me forward but offered little comfort. The hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chatter of colleagues felt distant and hollow. I performed my tasks methodically, yet each step reminded me of the dissonance between the life I had outwardly maintained and the one unfolding quietly in my heart. I found solace in small, silent moments, the weight of a pen in my hand, the soft rustle of paper, the distant hum of traffic outside, fragments of normalcy that anchored me just enough to survive. Sleep became a fragile companion. Nights were long, quiet stretches where memories pressed in, uninvited but insistent. I would wake in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe, and feel the enormity of what had been silently building. The mind wandered through old rooms, revisiting old conversations, recalling gestures and words I had once overlooked. Each recollection brought a mix of sorrow and understanding, as though the house itself were guiding me through the mourning process, one quiet reflection at a time. In this liminal space, grief was not loud. It did not demand attention. It whispered in pauses between thoughts, in the empty spaces at the table, in the soft sighs of the wind. I allowed myself to sit with it, to acknowledge the emptiness that had grown between what was performed and what was real. Tears came, not in torrents, but in gentle waves, quiet acknowledgments of the life I had lived and the illusions I had sustained. I began to journal, writing things I could not say aloud. Words flowed slowly, awkwardly at first, then more freely as the weight of silence lifted slightly. I wrote about the small betrayals, the overlooked warnings, the life that had carried me along without truly letting me breathe. Each sentence was a step toward understanding, a quiet reckoning with the shadows that had quietly followed me. The act of writing became a form of ceremony, a way to honor the grief without being consumed by it, a way to place the past alongside the present in a space that felt safe to witness. The days passed like shadows, stretching long and uneven, but in their length, I began to notice subtle shifts. I noticed the early morning light filtering through the lace curtains, soft and forgiving. I noticed the gentle creak of the floors beneath my feet, grounding me in a world that still existed beyond my grief. And I noticed, finally, the first stirrings of a fragile awareness that even amidst the emptiness, life persisted. That even as the lie I had lived unraveled, there was room for something quietly hopeful to emerge. The morning was not dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no breaking points that changed everything in a single instant. Instead, it was a slow, creeping awareness of what had been lost, tempered by a tentative acknowledgement of what remained. It was in the quiet corners of the house, in the shards of broken mugs and the dust motes dancing in the pale sunlight, that I began to feel the first flickers of presence. Presence of memory, presence of self, presence of life beyond the shadows. I learned to inhabit the silence, to breathe in its weight without being crushed by it. I learned to let the sadness settle, to recognize it as part of a process rather than an enemy, and in that stillness, I began to see the faint outline of what might come next, a possibility of clarity, of understanding, of a life reconstructed with truth at its center. Each day passed quietly, but each day carried its own meaning. Even in numbness there was recognition. Even in mourning there was movement. The shadows lengthened and shifted, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the light began to return, soft, tentative, and gentle, as though reminding me that the world continued, and that within it, I could find the courage to exist authentically once more. In the quiet that followed those long, shadowed days, I began to look inward with a kind of gentle curiosity I had never allowed myself before. The grief had loosened something within me, peeling back the layers I had carefully constructed, exposing truths I had long ignored. I traced the outlines of my own life, noticing how the patterns I had followed, the smiles I had painted on, were not just for the world, but also for myself, a defense against the discomfort of facing reality. The recognition came slowly. I saw that the life I thought was mine had been shaped as much by avoidance as by intention. The polite conversations, the quiet compromises, the careful glossing over of small disappointments, all were threads in a fabric that had begun to fray. I realized, with both ache and clarity, that the lie I had been living was not a single moment of betrayal, but a series of tiny silences, overlooked signs, and unspoken truths that had grown over years into something I could no longer ignore. Memories came unbidden, one after another. I remembered smiling through arguments that should have been spoken aloud, nodding along when my voice should have risen, laughing when tears would have been honest. Each recollection brought a pang, not of bitterness toward anyone else, but of sorrow for myself, for the part of me that had hidden in plain sight, even as life demanded authenticity. And yet in that sorrow there was a flicker of understanding. I was not weak. I was surviving. I had learned quietly and without fanfare to keep moving forward in a world that often demanded appearances over honesty. I began to revisit moments that once felt insignificant, gestures, conversations, silences, and saw them in a new light. I saw how my family, too, had adapted to the rhythm of pretending. The lies we lived were not just mine. They were a shared creation, a silent agreement to maintain peace at the expense of truth. Compassion grew alongside awareness. I understood that everyone does what they can with the tools they are given, and that sometimes survival takes the form of quiet compromise. The reflection extended to the objects around me. The shard of the broken mug I had held for so long became more than a symbol of loss. It became a mirror. I saw myself in its jagged edge, fractured, but still catching the light. I realized that the pieces of life I had ignored, the moments I had dismissed, were not broken beyond repair. They were fragments waiting to be understood, integrated, and recognized for what they truly were. I began to write again, not to capture the past as it had happened, but to explore it as it lived in memory and in feeling. Words flowed in quiet waves, revealing the shape of the lies I had told, both to myself and to others. And as I wrote, I felt the weight of judgment lift slightly. Compassion replaced condemnation. Pain began to transform into perspective. I saw the truth with tender eyes. The lies were not malicious. They were survival, adaptation, and fear woven together. Morning routines, once hollow, began to carry subtle meaning. The smell of coffee brewing became a signal of continuity, not emptiness. The sunlight through the window seemed softer, less accusing, more forgiving. In small, almost imperceptible ways, I noticed the world offering cues of life's resilience, the slow unfurling of a leaf, the distant laughter of children, the rhythmic creak of floors that had known countless footsteps. Each observation reminded me that life persisted, even when honesty had been delayed, and that it was never too late to begin living with awareness. Conversations with myself became gentle explorations. I asked not, why did this happen, but how did I arrive here? The answer was not a single moment, not a single fault, but a mosaic of choices, fears, compromises, and protective instincts. Each layer revealed not guilt, but context, not shame, but understanding. And in that understanding, I discovered the faint beginnings of grace, a space where I could hold both the mistakes and the intentions, the sorrow and the survival, the pain and the quiet learning. I began to notice small gestures of life returning. Music played softly in the background, and I let it fill the quiet rooms without trying to fill the emptiness with it. I tended to plants that had been neglected, feeling the connection between care and growth. I even found moments to look out the window without expectation, letting my eyes rest on the ordinary beauty of passing clouds and swaying branches. These small acts became rituals of healing, reminders that presence, attention, and awareness were themselves forms of truth. Through reflection, I came to see that the shape of my own lies was not meant to be condemned. It was meant to be understood. Each hidden truth, each unspoken word, each compromise had been a necessary step along a path that was slowly leading me toward clarity. Pain remained, yes, a gentle, persistent ache, but it was no longer a weight I carried alone. It was a companion, guiding me toward empathy, compassion, and perspective. And so, I began to see the lie not as a failure, but as a story, my story. One with shadows and fragments, with moments of grace hidden beneath layers of pretense. And in acknowledging it fully, I felt the first stirrings of something I had long forgotten. The quiet, patient hope that life, even when complicated by our own fears, could be lived honestly, tenderly, and with meaning. It was in this understanding that I prepared, silently, for the next step, a step not toward confrontation, but toward truth, a step that would carry me from reflection into action, from silence into liberation, from the careful shelter of lies into the fragile, luminous space of authenticity. The day came quietly, without fanfare or announcement, the way some truths arrive uninvited, pressing gently yet insistently against the heart. I had rehearsed the words endlessly in my mind, circling them like fragile birds on the edge of a window pane, afraid they would shatter if I let them fly. And yet, somehow, the weight of silence had grown heavier than the fear. It was a quiet pressure that demanded acknowledgement, an unspoken insistence that the life I had been performing could no longer hold me. I began by breathing slowly, noticing the ordinary sounds around me, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant creak of a floorboard, the subtle swish of a curtain in a breeze. These small details, once background, became anchors, They reminded me that life continued, that the world would not pause for my honesty. And yet it would allow me to speak it, carefully, fully, without condemnation. And then, I spoke. Not with accusation, not with flourish, not with a demand for explanation. I simply spoke what had been living in quiet corners of my heart for years, that I had been hiding, pretending, and shaping my life to please the world while I quietly unraveled inside. The words trembled at first, fragile and uncertain, yet they were undeniably mine. They fell softly into the space between us, filling the quiet rooms with a delicate kind of truth. The reaction was not immediate. There was a pause so profound it felt like time had thickened. And in that pause, I realized something remarkable. The truth does not need validation to exist. It simply is. And though fear had told me it would destroy everything, I began to feel instead a subtle unbinding, a loosening of chains I had not realized were gripping me. Eyes met mine, not with anger, but with recognition, or perhaps a quiet acceptance I had not anticipated. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden eruptions of emotion, only a shared acknowledgement that what had been hidden could now breathe. In that silent exchange, I felt the walls I had built for safety crumble just enough to let light in. I noticed the ordinary details again, a cup set gently on the table, a breeze drifting lazily through the open window, sunlight flickering across familiar surfaces. Each small movement felt amplified, intimate, like the world itself was listening, allowing my honesty its rightful place. I realized then that truth is not an event. It is a presence, a careful unfolding, a gentle act of revealing what has always existed beneath the surface. Speaking the truth did not erase the past. It did not undo the years of pretending, the subtle compromises, or the quiet betrayals, my own and those of others. But it made space for something previously impossible. Clarity. I could finally see the contours of my life without the distortion of concealment, and in that clarity, I discovered a fragile, luminous freedom, the kind that does not shout, but hums quietly within the chest, steady and insistent. The liberation was not loud. It did not announce itself with fireworks or dramatic declarations. It arrived in small shifts, the shoulders that had held tension for years relaxing, the chest expanding with easier breaths, the mind unclenching in relief. There was room for tears, but they were gentle, not cathartic. They fell as quiet witnesses to the honesty I had long feared, a soft acknowledgement of all that had been endured and all that could now begin anew. I noticed the subtle changes in myself, too. My voice carried a steadiness I had not known. My eyes, though wary, held a quiet lucidity. Even the simplest gestures, pouring coffee, arranging papers, glancing out the window, felt imbued with intention. Each act became a reaffirmation of the truth I had dared to speak, a small ceremony of acknowledgement that life, even after deception, could move forward. There were moments of reflection, brief pauses where doubt whispered its usual cautions. Perhaps this truth would fracture things, perhaps it would create distance. But the voice of lived experience, gentle, unhurried, reminded me that concealment had already cost me more than fear ever could. Honesty, even when fragile, was a reclamation, a reclaiming of space, breath, and self. As the day wore on, I felt a quiet ripple of peace spreading through ordinary moments. A chair moved slightly in the sunlight. A soft gust of wind stirred the curtains, and I understood that these small, ordinary movements carried significance. The world continued as it always had, but now I moved through it unmasked, not with grand gestures, but with the steady presence of a person who had finally claimed her own voice. There was a lightness that came from no longer holding the weight of hidden truths. Even as uncertainty lingered, because life inevitably is uncertain, the heaviness of pretending had lifted. I could walk in my home without fear of encountering the ghosts of unspoken words. I could hear my own thoughts clearly, without the static of concealment. And in that clarity, I felt the beginnings of a quiet joy, the kind that is not loud or celebratory, but persistent, intimate, and real. I did not rush to resolve everything. Liberation, I learned, does not demand immediate repair of the past. It asks only that we recognize our truth, honor it, and allow it to shape the present. The next steps would come in time, But for now, the simple act of speaking, of finally giving voice to years of quiet concealment, was itself an act of healing, an opening of doors long closed, a tender reclamation of life that had been lived in half shadows. And so, the house that had once felt heavy with silence now held a different resonance. The air seemed lighter, shadows softened, light traveled more freely across familiar surfaces. I moved through these ordinary spaces with a new awareness, carrying not only my own presence but the gentle, persistent truth of having spoken it aloud. In the stillness that followed, I understood honesty, once voiced, has a quiet power. It does not shout, it does not demand. It simply allows what has been hidden to breathe, to exist, and in doing so, it frees not only the heart, but the life that surrounds it. And in that freedom, I felt the faint beginnings of something precious, the possibility of living unguarded, fully present and tenderly for the first time in years. The days that followed were quiet, almost imperceptible in their unfolding, yet they carried a weight far deeper than any dramatic moment could. Life moved with its usual rhythms, sunlight spilling across wooden floors, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirping of birds. Yet now, everything felt slightly different. Not grandly different, not spectacular, but subtly, tenderly transformed. There was room for breath, for presence, for noticing the little things that had once been overshadowed by pretense. I began to see the ordinary not as background, but as life itself. A steaming cup of coffee in the morning became a small ceremony, its warmth against my hands, the faint aroma curling into the quiet kitchen, carried the affirmation of living honestly, even in the simplest way. The chipped mug I had once kept as a reminder of brokenness now caught sunlight on its jagged edge. Sparkling gently, a tiny tangible proof that imperfection could hold beauty. The house, which had often felt too large, too silent, and too heavy, became a canvas for these small rediscoveries. Curtains swayed with the wind, floorboards creaked under careful steps, and light found corners it had never lingered in before. Each ordinary sound, each minor detail, reminded me that life had not ended in the revelation of truth. It had only begun to be seen clearly. There were moments of reflection in these quiet days, when I noticed the way sunlight pooled on the kitchen table, or when the evening breeze carried the scent of rain through the open window. These moments were gentle reminders that the heart, once unburdened, can feel deeply without the sharp ache of pretense. I could sit in stillness and simply be, allowing thought and memory to drift through me without judgment or urgency. Evenings became tender with small rituals, arranging flowers, folding laundry, straightening chairs, simple acts that now felt intimate rather than performative. Music played softly in the background, not to fill a void, but to accompany life's quiet unfolding. I listened to its tones with a new attentiveness, appreciating the way a familiar melody could feel fresh, alive, and comforting when approached without distraction. The people around me, friends, neighbors, distant acquaintances, remained largely unaware of the internal shifts I had undergone. Yet that no longer mattered. The liberation of honesty is not always witnessed by others. It is, first and foremost, a private reclamation, a quiet settling into the truth of one's own being. I moved through my days with a subtle steadiness, a gentle confidence that had nothing to prove. I found joy, not in spectacle, but in presence. A bird alighting on the windowsill, the rustle of leaves, the way sunlight glinted off a teacup. These became small lights, tiny affirmations of life's resilience. Even a piece of broken glass or the chipped edge of a mug could hold a kind of quiet wonder, a reminder that imperfection does not diminish beauty, but shapes it. Sometimes, I caught myself smiling softly, not at a joke or story, but at the simple fact of being alive in a space where truth was no longer hidden. The ordinary became extraordinary simply because it was experienced honestly, without the weight of pretense or fear. It was a tenderness that filled the chest lightly, a warmth that didn't demand attention, yet lingered steadily. And in these small lights, I found peace. It was not a loud, final resolution. There were still memories, old wounds, moments of doubt, but there was also a gentle acceptance that life, in all its flaws and quiet beauty, could be enough. The pieces of the past, the broken moments, The concealed truths, all coalesced into a delicate mosaic, a life imperfect, real, and fully lived. I realized that peace is not a grand event. It does not arrive with fireworks or ceremonial closure. It is a subtle shift in perspective, a willingness to inhabit life as it is, not as we wish it to be. It is noticing the sunlight, listening to the wind, feeling warmth in small, everyday gestures. It is the quiet acknowledgement that even amidst imperfection, there is room for love, tenderness, and presence. The final lesson of these ordinary days was simple and profound. Life's light is found not in dramatic transformation, but in the small, persistent moments that quietly remind us that we are here, that we have survived, and that we can move forward with authenticity. And so, I carried on, not with fanfare, not with proclamation, but with a soft, steady heart. I noticed the light on the windowsill, the blooming plant near the kitchen table, the chipped mug catching sunlight. I listened, I breathed, I lived. In these small, ordinary gestures, I discovered a lasting, tender peace, a quiet affirmation that life, truth, and presence are enough, and for the first time in years, I felt entirely wholly at home, not in a house, or a role or an expectation, but in the delicate, luminous reality of my own life.